Okay, let's take our Bibles and turn to these verses that Diana read plus, and I'm only going to be looking at half of the, or not half of the chapter, but just part of the chapter this morning, and there's just too much information in here, I feel, to try to take the whole chapter at once. So, if I can get my pages apart here, I know I can do it. There. And I've titled this chapter just Be Sure Your Sin Will Find You Out, and we'll see how that works as we go along. But last week we looked at the faith that led the children of Israel up to the walls of Jericho, and then around the walls of Jericho, and then over the walls of Jericho. And God did the whole thing. They didn't have to do anything but just be obedient, and God did the rest of it. And so as we think of just all the miracles that God did for the children of Israel from the time they were getting ready to come out of Egypt to the time that they hit right up to where they are today, just one miracle after another God performed on their behalf, and is a God of miracles. And we're going to see that in this chapter here as well too, how God worked beyond what they could even imagine. And so there's no doubt that Israel's faith was encouraged when they did what God told them to do and the walls fell down. And it has to encourage your faith when you see God at work in these different ways. Faith that would help them move forward. And without faith, it's impossible to please God. And so we need to live by faith, we need to walk by faith, and we need to allow faith to be part of our life. We skipped over, in essence, an important part of last chapter, but I did that deliberately because it comes up in this chapter here now, and the sin that caused problems for Israel. And you know the story, no doubt, but anyway, we'll look at the major part of the story next week. Verse 1 of chapter 7, Joshua chapter 7, verse 1 says, But the children of Israel committed a trespass regarding the accursed things, for Achan the son of Camri, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah of the tribe of Judah, took of the accursed things, so the anger of the Lord burned against the children of Israel. In chapter 6, verse 18, it says, And you, by all means, abstain from the accursed things, lest you become accursed when you take of the accursed things, and make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. Well, that's what happened. And God told them back there, we're going to take the land, but don't take anything that you shouldn't be taking. Those things that were taken were supposed to go into the treasury for the house of God, and the rest, were to be burned up. And God told them to kill everything that breathed. That seems kind of harsh, doesn't it? Men, women, boys, and girls, didn't matter who it was or whatever, but kill everything, even the animals, to kill the whole works. And why would he do that? Well, I believe there was a reason for that, because he didn't want his people to be contaminated with sin. And this we know as we progress through this on down the road a ways, that's what happened to them. They didn't do all that God told them to do, and as a result of that, they became contaminated with that. But going back to this, does a little sin matter? Does it make a difference if we sin just a little bit? It doesn't matter the size of the sin in God's eyes. I don't think God has big sins and little sins. It's either sin, I believe, or it's not sin. And in this case, it was sin, and little sins do matter, regardless of what we think the size of that sin is. But verse 1 tells us not only who sinned, but God's view of that sin. The last part of that verse says, So the anger of the Lord burned against the children of Israel because of the sin that Achan committed there during that time. He saw some things that he had an interest in, and even though God said don't take those things, he took them and he hid them under the floor of his tent. And tried to pass. Nobody. Who's going to find out? Who's going to know that he had taken anything that he wasn't supposed to? I mean, here's all these things that the people there in Jericho had, and who's going to miss just a couple of things that he put underneath of the floor of his tent? Well, God knew, and as a result of that, trouble came to the Israelites. You know, all the activity of the conquest, who would know that this small little thing had taken place, and God had done such tremendous things for them, and now we're going to see that causes the problems. This sin causes problems in their life. They had shekels of silver and 200 shekels of silver and a garment and a wedge of gold. And so what? What difference does it make? It's there and looked good to him, and so he took it. But Achan knew the consequences for his sin, but he thought he could get away with it. And isn't that the way we think? Isn't that the way we think that it's just a little tiny sin, and what difference does it make? Nobody's ever going to even know about it, and as long as nobody knows about it, what difference does it make? Well, God knows, doesn't he? When there's sin in our lives, God knows that sin, and it's a big thing to him. It's not a little thing to him, but it's a big thing to God when we sin. And again, Achan knew the consequences of that sin, that he couldn't get away with it. But Satan would love to make us think that we can. Satan, I believe, caused Achan to think that he could get away with it. And he does the same thing for us today, too. Nobody's going to know the difference. Who's going to know if you do or don't do something? And if there's a little sin in your life, nobody's even going to know about it except you. And of course, we leave God out of that equation there. But God knows, even if nobody else does, God knows whether there's sin in our life or not. And I don't believe Achan knew the consequences of his sin. You know, it's just I took these things and I hid them, and eventually I'm going to have possession of them. Right now they're hidden in my tent, but I'll get to where I can use them. He didn't realize the consequences that when you sin, it not only affects you, but affects a whole lot of other people as well too. And in this case here, it affected the whole Israel as a nation. It affected them and really caused some problems, as we'll see. Because of Achan's sin, they went up to spy out the land there in Ai, which, as I understand, was about probably 20 miles from where they were down to Jericho. And someone has said that it was C.I. Schofield. Well, no, it was go up there that they were supposed to go up there, and it was a rugged country, I guess, going up that hillside to where Ai was. And they went up there and spied out the land. Joshua sent them up there. In verse 2 says, "Now Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai and to spy out that land, go up and spy out the country." So the men went up and spied out that Ai and the country there where they were. When sin's in the lives of people, a lot of people suffer with that until sin is dealt with. And I believe the same is true in a church. If there's sin in a church, the whole church is going to suffer as a result of that until it's dealt with and it's taken care of. The health of the body depends on the health of its members. If you got some sick members, then the rest of the church is affected by it. Don't we see that this morning? We have some sick members, and it affects. Yeah. For those of you on watching by video, we have one in the front that's sick, and somebody else had to take his place. But anyway, it affects the church, doesn't it? When there's sin in the church, and others are affected by it. C.I. Schofield said, "The whole cause of Christ is injured by the sin, neglect, or unspirituality of even one believer." And this is why the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians told him to excommunicate the one there that had sinned. Do you remember that? In fact, let's just turn over to it in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, and in 11 and 13 it says, It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and such sexual immorality as it is not even named among the Gentiles, that a man has his father's wife. And you are puffed up and have not rather mourned that he who has done this deed might be taken away from among you. And in verses 11 through 13. But now I have written to you not to keep company with anyone named a brother who is sexually immoral, or covetous, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or an extortioner, not even to eat with such a person. For what have I to do with judging those who are outside? Do you not judge those who are inside? But those who are outside God judges. Therefore put away from yourselves the evil person. And so Paul told them to put him out of the church. And that was done for a reason, not to crush him. And it was a brother, he calls him a brother there. So it had to be a Christian. Put him out of the church, and then for the purpose of bringing him back to the Lord, for repenting. And we see that did happen with this particular individual. But, in our story here this morning, we don't see Achan really repenting of his sin that he committed. I believe that we, like Achan, take sin too lightly. Who's it going to hurt? What difference is it going to make? If it affects anybody, it only affects me. But that's not really the case, is it? When a person sins, it affects a lot more than just themselves. Who would know, again, what we've done, or what we said, or what we've thought, what we did this morning before we even came to church? Sometimes I remember Chuck Swindoll telling a story about how he was following this little Volkswagen along, and the two people were in there just arguing, and then pulled into the church parking lot and got out. And they were friendly then, but on the way there they were arguing and carrying on. And I think sometimes we have that problem of doing that kind of thing. We sin, and then we come to church and act like nothing ever happened, like we're all okay with God. And that's not the case. Does God care if we sin? Obviously he does, doesn't he? And in the story, as it goes on, we'll see that not only did Achan lose his life, but so did some others, his whole family. Everything, his family, his own life, his family, all lost their lives. All of his animals lost their life. Everything he had, everything he owned, they took out and got rid of, just because Achan had sinned. Sin's not without some form of retribution. And to me, this chapter shows the sin of greed. As I read through this chapter, that's what it seems like. I see this thing, and I want it. Greed, sin of greed. That can get us into a lot of trouble, can it? And it certainly got Achan into trouble with God. Is greed worth the wages that it brings? The wages of death? Certainly doesn't. Verses 2 and 3, the preparation. Now Joshua sent men up into Jericho to Ai, which is beside Bethaven, on the east side of Bethel, and spoke to them, saying, Go up and spy out the country. So the men went up and spied out Ai. And they returned to Joshua and said to him, Do not let all the people go up, but let about 2,000 or 3,000 men go up and attack Ai. Do not worry all the people there, for the people of Ai are few. So the preparation, sent a few guys up, 2,000 or 3,000 fighting men up there, and they can take care of the problem. And so this is what Joshua did, based upon what the spies reported back to him. Reverend John Urquhart said of the area between Jericho and Ai that it was a steep and toilsome ascent. And this alone would take a toll on the army to have to climb up these about 20 miles up to Ai and kind of wore them out. But I don't know, I just like the story because there's some pretty neat things happen in this story. But another, and probably the most likely, is Israel's self-confidence in their own strength. Yeah, just send up a couple thousand people. We can take them. And you remember when they went around up to Jericho, and God did everything, didn't He? They went around, they obeyed God, they went around the times that He told them to, and things like this. And here, hey, we got this one made. Let's go ahead and just send a few people up. We'll defeat Ai, and then we'll go ahead and take that city up there. So what did they do? Joshua, based on the information he had, his military, his advisors, if you want to say it that way, said, don't worry about it. We got this one made. We can take just a few guys and complete that job, and we'll be on our way. After all, they conquered Jericho, which was a lot larger city, a lot more fortified city than Ai ever was. But again, they didn't take in the factor that God was with them at Jericho, and it was a miracle. But God left them to prove to themselves that they couldn't do it in their own strength. They needed God's strength to take the city. Even though they tried it on their own selves, by their own selves, and it just simply did not work for them. They relaxed a little, and that's when they experienced defeat. I think the principle that we need to remember here is just don't ever let your guard down, and trust in the Lord. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He'll direct your path. And this is what God was wanted to do with the Israelites as they went up into Ai. He wanted to be their leader, but they said, in essence, they basically said, we don't need you, God. We don't need you. We'll handle this one here on our own. And when we do that, Satan will always bring us to defeat, even by what seems to be the smallest thing. I can handle this. I can live this way. I can do this thing, and I get away with it. Nobody will even know. And the verse shows me, not only verses 2 and 3 show me the sin of pride. In the first verse there, greed, and in these verses, the sin of pride. What does God say about pride and of our sin and pride? Over in Proverbs chapter 6, verse 17, it says there's some things that God hates. And a proud look was the number one thing on the list that God hated, pride. And here we see this. We can do it. We don't need your help, God. Just take it easy and we'll take care of this one ourselves. The preparation. And then the failure in verses 4 and 5. So about 3,000 men went up there from the people, but they fled before the men of Ai. And the men of Ai struck down about 36 men, for they chased them from before the gate as far as Shebarim, and struck them down on the descent. Therefore the hearts of the people melted and became like water. Does that kind of sound familiar? When they were getting ready to go into Jericho, and the two spies went in there, and Rahab says, our hearts melted within us. And more than one occasion that people were talking about their hearts melting. Here's the same thing, only this was a different here. The Israelites here, their hearts melted. They went up to Ai. This few thousand men went up there, and I wasn't sure why they turned tail and ran without really even any particular fighting going on. I think I know the answer, and we'll look at that next week. But it doesn't say why they ran. It doesn't say they went up and engaged in a battle and were starting to get defeated, and so they turned around, and it just says that they went up there. And verse 5 again, the men of Ai struck down about 36 of them, and they fled before the men of Ai. It's my understanding that approximately 36 men was all they ever lost in battle. And all these different battles that they were involved with, and different conquering of the different cities, 36. Can you imagine that? Out of all the different ones that they went up against. And the reason being was God was on their side in these other cases, but here they left God out, so God allowed about 36 of them to be killed in this as they were running, trying to get away from the men of Ai. Again, they ran and their hearts melted. The hearts of the people melted and became like water. It's interesting that when there's sin in our lives, the littlest things can easily bring about our defeat. And I see this in this verse here. Sin of fear. Whatever reason, they must have been afraid that they turned and ran. There must have been fear. in their hearts as they ran to try to get away from these people that were living there, or the army at least, that were there in Ai watching that city. It seemed as though God had turned his back on his people. If you just read the story and you stop there, you'd say that, God turned his back on these people, and he didn't do what he should have been doing. He didn't protect them. He didn't help them. But they didn't want his help. They figured they could do it in their own strength. So, God, take this one easy. Sit out this one, and we'll go ahead and do it. And then you can maybe help on the next one. But this one here, we don't need your help. There's not enough to even mess with. So they didn't want God's help. So God didn't help them. And as a result of that, they experienced defeat. Just got into Jericho, and the tremendous things that happened there at Jericho, and now wham, they get zapped with this defeat of the people there from Ai, the army there at Ai. The testimony that they had to the surrounding nations, I believe, was greatly damaged. Before it said all the people, their hearts melted, and the people in the land would see that God is working on behalf of the Israelites, and now he let them down, at least in the eyes of the people there. God let them down, and maybe they're not so tough after all. Maybe we can beat the Israelites. And so their testimony to the surrounding nations, I believe, was greatly damaged with that defeat. You think it went throughout the country? I believe it did. Wow, we beat the Israelites. We chased them down, killed some of their people, and there's nothing said there that they lost any, but we chased them down and killed some of their people, and I think that probably spread throughout the country. But this loss troubled Joshua, and we see there that in verse 6, it says, Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell to the earth on his face before the ark of the Lord until evening, and he and the elders of Israel, and they put dust on their heads. The failure, they didn't take God with them. They tried to do it on their own. And now the question that comes up. And Joshua said, Alas, Lord God, why have you brought this people over the Jordan at all, to deliver us into a hand of the Amorites, to destroy us? Oh, that we had been content and dwell on the other side of the Jordan. Oh Lord, what shall I say when Israel turns its back before its enemies? Oh God, why did you bring us out here? Why did you bring us out to just be defeated and destroyed? We'd have been better off to stay on the east side of the Jordan and not even come over here. And it says that Joshua and the elders fell on their face before God, before the Ark of the Covenant, and stayed there until evening, trying to determine what was the problem. It's back in verse 6 again. They're on the earth, on their face before the Ark of the Lord until evening. He had the elders of Israel, and they put dust on their heads. Just why? Why, God? Why didn't you help us? What's the problem? Here we are, your people, and you've been helping us. Now all of a sudden you really let us down, God. You blew it this time, and we don't know if we can trust you anymore or not. And so they question God and why he didn't help them during this difficult time. I believe this is probably maybe the lowest point in Joshua's spiritual walk with the Lord. Why didn't you help us? Oh Lord, what shall I say when Israel turns its back on its enemies? And back up in verse 7 again. Alas, O Lord, why have you brought this people over the Jordan at all, to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites, to destroy us? Oh, that we had been content to dwell on the other side of the Jordan. Do you see him down pretty low down? And just the fact that he was really discouraged, I believe, at this point in time. Because something that seems tragic happens to us doesn't necessarily mean that there's sin in our lives, although sometimes people teach that, don't they? If something happens to you, it's because there's sin in your life. And that's not necessarily true. It could be, but not necessarily true. And Satan would love to get us so discouraged. And it can happen even to the best of Christians. We don't ever want to feel like we're exempt from discouragement, because don't we go up and down sometimes? We get encouraged and we get discouraged. We get encouraged, we get discouraged when we see different things happening. So anyway, Joshua at this point in time is really discouraged. And a discouraged Christian, I believe, is a real asset to Satan's work. He wants to get us discouraged. You know, we used to sing that song in our youth group when we were growing up. Down in the dumps I'll never go. That's where the devil keeps me low. I don't remember all the words to it, but you know, just the fact that Satan would love to get us discouraged. And when he's got us discouraged, he's got us defeated. And so we need to stay above that. How did God feel about their actions? What did he say there to them? They were to get up off of their, verse 10. So the Lord said to Joshua, "Get up. Why do you lie thus on your face? Israel has sinned, and they have also transgressed my covenant, which I commanded them. For they have even taken some of the accursed things, and have stolen and deceived, and they have also put it among their own stuff." Joshua, get up. Don't lay there on your face and carry on. You guys, one of your people at least caused that, or some of your people, and we'll find out later next week how that was determined. But get up and get about business. Don't lay there in a defeated attitude. And we'll continue with the rest of this chapter next week. But let me just say Numbers 32:23 says, well, let me read the whole verse. It says, "But if you do not do so, then take note, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out." He was talking there about the people who wanted to stay on the east side of the Jordan, and they didn't. Then Joshua said, "Okay, you can stay on the east side, but you need to go over, your armies need to go over and help fight and take the land, and when that's taken, then you can come back over and stay on the east side. If you don't," he says, "you've sinned against the Lord, and your sin is going to find you out." What Moses is talking about here were the Israelites that wanted to stay on the east side of the Jordan. If they didn't do what they were supposed to do, their sin would find them out. To me, it all boils down to this. You don't sin and get away with it. We might think we do, and nothing drastic happens to us, like I think of, in the story of Achan here, but I think of over there in Acts chapter 5, Ananias and Sapphira. You know, they sinned, lied to the Holy Spirit, and God zapped them right on the spot, basically. And because that doesn't happen to us, we think we're getting away with sin. But we really aren't, are we? And be sure your sin will find you out. And this is what happened to Achan and his family. We don't sin and get away with it as far as God is concerned. So the rest of the story next week. And it's not a pleasant story, but it's part of what happened. Some of it's good and some of it's not so good. We see that God gets back in control of things, and it's tough on Achan and his family, but God brought the children of Israel through there. So just remember that we don't sin and get away with it. Let's pray. Father, thank you for who you are, and we thank you for the fact that you know, even if no one else in the whole world knows, when we sin, you know about it. And so we just pray that you would help us to not be that kind of person. And then it seems like so often we are, hoping that nobody else will ever find out about it. And yet, even if no one ever did, you know. And in this case here, the whole group of the Israelites found out, and it was exposed to them. And so we just thank you that you care about us, and we thank you for stories like this, that even though sin affected their first battle with Ai, turns out better the next time. So help us to be the kind of people you want us to be. Help us to live above sin as best we can with your help. We don't have to sin. We choose to. And this was the case here with Achan. He chose to sin. He didn't have to, but he chose to. And that's the way we are, I believe, as well, too. So help us not to do that. We thank you for that in your name. Amen.